Good afternoon. My name is Kelly Vlahos. I'm Senior Advisor to the Quincy Institute and Editorial Director of Responsible Statecraft. And I am very excited to open today's discussion, The Pentagon, Climate Change and War, with author and Quincy Institute non-resident fellow Neta Crawford, along with Governor Jerry Brown and former Congressman John Tierney moderating. The conversation will be centered on Neta's brand new book, The Pentagon, Climate Change and War, Charting the Rise and Fall of U.S. Military Emissions. If you are not familiar with the Quincy Institute, you must know that this book represents the clearest of our goals to place checks on military overreach and power projection overseas, as well as the military-industrial complex at home, and to redirect precious resources back to the U.S. national interest. Addressing security effects of climate change is both in that national interest and is critical for ensuring global peace. We are proud to highlight Neta's tremendous work in this area in her book and in all of her research and guidance at the Cost of War Project at Brown University. There seems to be no more salient time than now to be talking about the effects of the U.S. military primacy on climate as the dynamics of war have shifted again, this time from Central Asia and Middle East to Eastern Europe. Tomorrow it may be China. How can we demilitarize U.S. foreign policy so that we can settle our problems abroad without the disastrous effects that the war machine has on the future of our world? These are the questions that we will try to tackle today. And we clearly have a lot on our table here, so I'd like to get the conversation going. I'm going to turn this over to Congressman Tierney to properly introduce our speakers and engage in the discussion, and then I will be back at the end of the panel to close out. So thank you, Congressman Tierney, for moderating today, and I'll see you all at the end of the program.
Well, thank you, Kelly. It's nice to join you and the Governor Neta here this morning. And I would just like to introduce both of our speakers and then ask each of them to give a presentation. First, let me introduce Governor Jerry Brown. He is the former governor of California several times over. After graduating from high school, he entered the Sacred Heart Novitiate, a Jesuit seminary, and later attended the University of California at Berkeley. And upon graduation there, he went and got his Juris Doctorate degree at Yale Law School, graduating in 1964. He was then elected trustee of the Los Angeles Community College District in 1969, California's Secretary of State in 1970, Governor of California in 1974, and reelected in 1978. In 1998, 20 years later, Governor Brown was elected mayor of Oakland, and then in 2006, California Attorney General, and elected to a third gubernatorial term in 2010 and to a historic fourth term in 2014. He currently serves as chair of the California-China Climate Institute, which is housed at the University of California, Berkeley. He's the executive chair of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist. He's on the board of the Nuclear Threat Initiative. Our first speaker today is author Neta C. Crawford. Neta is a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute and the Montague Burton Professor of International Relations at the University of Oxford. She holds a professorial fellowship at Balliol College at the University of Oxford and is a member of the Committee on International Security Studies at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Neta is also co-director of the Cost of War Project that is based at Brown University, and she's a member of the board of directors of the Council for a Livable World. Her research focuses on war, ethics, normative change, emotions in world politics, and climate change. And of course, she is the author of the topic of conversation today, The Pentagon, Climate Change and War, Charting the Rise and Fall of the United States Military Emissions. Neta, we'd love to hear from you.
Okay, just so I'm on a level playing field with Congressman and Governor, you can call me Professor for fun. Okay, so thanks for the opportunity to talk about this issue. I think I want to cover just some main themes of the book and of my topic today. First, it's the role of war and military industry in emissions. Secondly, I'll talk about the U.S. military's understanding of fossil fuels and climate change. Third, I'll say something about the scale and trends of U.S. military emissions. Many countries have emissions that are lower than the United States' own military emissions. And the military is more greenhouse gas intensive than many other sectors of the economy. Fourth, I'll talk about what the DoD is doing to increase its adaptation and resilience and to reduce their emissions. I'll talk a little bit about how they think about security in the climate change world, and finally suggest some things that could be done a little bit differently. So the first point, the dominant understanding of the causes of climate change do not address the role of war and military mobilization and military industry. For the most part, they begin their tale of describing rising emissions with industrialization. So war has been part of the story, however, since emissions began to rise. And it's also been part of the story in explaining what people called the Little Ice Age in the 1500s and 1600s. And that occurred because the conquest of the Americas led to lots of agricultural land that was being farmed by Native Americans going back into forest. And that sequestered, that is, drew carbon out of the atmosphere, and is part of the reason why there was a global cooling in the 16th century. We see the opposite today. War, mobilization, and military industry have been an important driver of increased greenhouse gas emissions and deforestation. So in other words, war, by promoting the use of fossil fuel as the military industrialized, increasing military industrialization led to new industries and materials and more demand for fossil fuels. It also led states to, like the United States and others, to try to get bases around the world so that they could first get coal that they needed to make war and then oil. So the demand for fossil fuel has driven some of US foreign policy, and particularly in the Middle East, since the 1980s. But before that, the British in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, so on. So second point, the US military's understanding of climate change. The military has long focused on climate change and the consequences of increased levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and the oceans. In the 1950s, the scientist Roger Revelle testified before Congress of the need for more science because he was concerned that as ocean temperatures increased and the Arctic became navigable 12 months a year, this would lead to a rise in power of the Soviet Union. And this is a consistent concern from the Navy and others since the 1950s. The US Navy and Department of Defense have long funded basic climate change research, including the work of Revelle and Gilbert Plass and others who showed us the extent of climate change and its pace in the 1950s and 60s. And their work is the foundation upon which the international scientists are working now. The United States military began to consider the implications of climate change for operations in the 1990s more seriously, and were concerned about things such as changes in ocean salinity and changes in ports. Now they're concerned increasingly about installations. Importantly, the Department of Defense attempted and succeeded in blocking inclusion of most military emissions from the Kyoto Protocol negotiations. And this was because they both feared the impact on operations if they had to cut fuel use, and they were concerned that overall this might constrain their capacity to be dominant in the world. It's unclear to me in the 1990s if the US had, the Department of Defense had yet calculated their full emissions, but they certainly knew that they were high. Now, if you look at US military emissions from the 1970s to the present, you see a couple things. First of all, in every period of war, US military emissions have increased, except in the, well, they were 110 million metric tons at two different peaks, 1975 and 1991. They've declined in the post-Cold War period. They went up in 2001 and 2003, and they've declined since their peaks in the post 9/11 wars. So in other words, emissions track war, but they're currently trending down. So the other thing that you want to understand, I think, about the military is that they've more recently taken a cue from former officials like Shelley Goodwin and focused on the risk of climate change to installations and operations, and also to questions of conflict. They've recently begun, in the last 10, 15 years, that is, to see climate change as a threat multiplier. And in the most recent documents, they're talking about global confrontations arising from revisionist powers seeking to take advantage of instabilities caused by climate change. That's one thing. Secondly, they've begun to explicitly plan to reduce their emissions. The DoD and the armed services have made pledges of reducing their emissions. The Army, for instance, pledges to reduce by 50% their total emissions by 2030 from a 2005 baseline. The Navy has a 2008 baseline, as does the Air Force, and they're also pledging reductions. Now, notably, they don't tell us what the numbers were at the baseline year, so we can't tell how ambitious their plans are from what they say, but they aren't tremendously ambitious because they've, in fact, mostly met those goals already. But it is important to recognize that they're trying to reduce their emissions. They're trying to reduce their emissions, I think, for two reasons. One is they're trying to become more efficient and be less dependent on fossil fuels more generally. And secondly, they've become increasingly aware of the scale of their both energy use, which is the largest in the United States, and their military emissions, which are, as an institution, the largest of any institution in the world. Now, the final point is the problem with some of this is that the approach to climate change as a threat multiplier actually makes two consequences. First, that the military is focused on regions where they say instability may arise because of climate change, which actually did not contribute most of the greenhouse gases in the world. And the way to respond to the instability that they focus on in Africa and in the island nations is not to increase military presence and capacity, but it would be to increase the capacity of those governments. And the second thing about the focus on securitization is it takes away from the overall need to reduce US military presence in areas of the world where it could be reduced. For example, in the Persian Gulf, where much of that presence has been focused on securing access to Persian Gulf oil. So that's my basic argument in just a few sentences, that I think that we're at a tipping point or a turning point in our understanding of the military's contribution to climate change. And we're also, if you look at the military institution itself, at a turning point where they're seeing that they need to reduce their emissions, but they've begun to settle on a view of climate change as a threat multiplier. The risks of climate change causing conflict are, first of all, not proven, and secondly, not direct. So that's my concern there.
Thank you very much, Professor. Governor Brown, would you add a few comments for us, please? And I might just note before you start that our audience on that, there's a question and answer button at the bottom of your screen, of course, and people may at any time enter a question if they'd like it shared with our panel, and we'd be happy to do that. Sorry about that, Governor. Thank you. You need to come off mute.
Okay, good. Here we go. So this is a very unusual book in that it's tying the military activity to create security with the creation of greater insecurity in the very process. There's a paradoxical element here that as we try to do one thing, it brings into being the very opposite of what we're trying. And what is crucial here is that the military itself is a major contributor of greenhouse gases, over 100 billion I think it's 100 billion a year, more than 40 or 50 countries in the world. So the military itself is generating greenhouse gases. And of course, as the military acts and expands and flexes its muscles, then the militaries in other places like China and Russia, in fact, all over, they also respond. So you get an interactive process. And from my point of view, what the book is trying to do, it's difficult, but Neta here is pointing out the connectivity of things. So we're worried about security. At the same time, the very activities of increased security, peace, protection, are actually doing the exact opposite. And if we're ever to get our handle on emissions and therefore reduce the mounting dangers of climate change, we're going to have to reduce military. The military is not about having battery-operated jeeps and tanks. It's about having fewer tanks and fewer military operations. Now that becomes very, very difficult. We've just got the Biden nuclear posture statement, the defense strategy. It's all premised on a world where the problems are external. The problems are caused by Putin. They're caused by some Arab country in the Middle East or some terrorist group. They're caused by the Chinese. But in fact, we live in an interdependent, interconnected, interactive world where what we do actually stimulates the very thing we're trying to defend against. And that, I think, is very well expressed by a word coined by Professor Norbert Weiner many years ago, cybernetic. And cybernetic means that it's not one thing laid off over against another. It's all these interacting parts that act as messages and information systems, very interconnected. And so we shape Russia through our own activities as Russia shapes us. Same thing with China. So we're in a world where the more we try to make things better, we actually make it worse. And this book makes very clear that we can only go so far in combating climate change without reducing the military. But you can't reduce the military unless you reduce the threat perceptions that are entertained by most elites and most major governments. So this is not a straightforward budgetary challenge. Go to Washington, get the military budget cut by X amount. That's not going to happen. What we have to do is to rise above the nationalistic perspective. Putin is really giving an example of perverse, toxic nationalism when he occupies Ukraine and wants Russia as an idea and as a sovereign to expand further and further, in this case, into Ukraine. It's all right now in modern politics, international relations, about sovereignty, about nationalisms. And what we have to move to is transnational consciousness, the awareness that we're all in it together and we can't do anything without affecting another country, other people. So we're all in this cybernetic, interactive system that there's no one place where you stand where you are free from all the influences that are around you, influences which we ourselves are contributing and constituting. So we are in the midst of a muddle, and to get out of it, we have to develop a very different perception of the world. It's what I call planetary realism, not the old-fashioned realism where it's my nation against your nation. That's always going to be there. But we have to see ourselves as interconnected, like the parts of our own body, the parts of a community. It's the world community, and we're all interacting. And the only way to reduce climate is to reduce industrial emissions and military emissions and the military conflicts that come out of the idea. The idea is wrong. We start with a hyper-nationalistic notion in a totally globally interdependent world. And that's why I say what we have to do is adopt a perspective of planetary realism. And we're far, far from that. And that's going to entail, with all our climate activities, if we're not cutting the military, we're not going to make the kind of progress we need. And for us to cut the military, we've got to get other countries to cut the military. But for them to cut the military, we're going to have a greater sense that we're all in it together, a greater sense of mutual security. And that really is a big challenge. And I think it's at the heart of this book that we're now talking about today.
Well, we're off to a thoughtful start. Thanks to both of our speakers. Professor, one of our guests obviously has written basic question is the contradiction between the United States military and climate change. Was that the way that you saw it as you were writing this?
Well, what I wanted to do was understand how did U.S. military emissions become so large? And one of the things I learned in writing the book was that military activity is more greenhouse gas intensive than civilian activity. Okay, so that's one thing. And then the second is that, as Governor Brown says, in our efforts to become more secure, that is, put bases abroad so that we can have access to coal and then later oil, we have made alliances with governments and with industries in regions that are less secure. And so that makes us less secure. So it's exactly as Governor Brown says, our efforts to become more secure have paradoxically made us less secure by increasing our vulnerability to supply chain disruptions and also to governments which don't want us to have bases there, or people who don't want us to have bases in regions. And then, but yes, it's not so much a contradiction as a tension. That what we see is our efforts have led us to a world where we seem to be locked in a deep cycle of acquisition of fossil fuels and then protecting the acquisition of fossil fuels. And it's an escalation. If we can get off that cycle, then we can reduce military emissions and, in fact, lots of other emissions.
Yeah, there's a big problem with trying to get off the cycle is that people make a lot of money off the cycle. There's a big payoff. We all are familiar with the notion of incentives, that when you want something, you want more money for that activity. If you want less of something, you take the money away. Well, the Pentagon, the military budget, is gigantic, and it's continuing to grow. Doesn't matter whether you got Obama or whether you got Trump or whether you got Bush. It's all upwards because the perception of America alone against all these adversaries requires a massive military spending. And the only way out is we're going to have to find a way to shift the perspectives to this global threat, which is climate. Climate is the perfect example of the global or planetary threat, or in the jargon of today, a transnational threat, because everything's national. It's hyper-national, ego for each country. Well, transnational means there's stuff, there's threats that are coming at all countries together, and that's climate. And so it's a great opportunity to see the world as it really is, an interactive, interdependent place. We don't operate that way. We act like Russia is a different order of being than America. But in fact, if you look over the last 150 years, America's been seeking oil and bases and wars and all these other activities. And so is the Russians in a different way. And now the Chinese are emerging in their own way. So to overcome that, we have to challenge the military spending, which is gross in itself, greater than 8 or 9 of the other largest military spenders. But secondly, the whole conversation, the nuclear posture review is all about a false description of the world. It has a lot of truth to it, but it doesn't provide the understanding or the framework to get us out of the fatal groove that we're now in. We're in a trajectory to disaster. That's why the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has its doomsday clock closer to doomsday than ever since the clock was first started after World War II. We're 100 seconds before midnight. And that is a reflection by top scientists of the danger we're in part by climate, in part by nuclear, in part by other cyber and other threats that we're all facing. So we are at a tipping point. In the book, it talks about an inflection point. Well, when you have 8 billion people on the planet and you have 2 trillion, almost 2 trillion in military budgets, and then you have the innovation that we're getting in nuclear and cyber and all these other weapons technologies, humankind is at the brink, or as one fellow from Oxford said, the precipice. And to get off it, we can't think like we have up till now. That's what Einstein said. The thinking has to be totally changed since the invention of the nuclear bomb, and now a few other technologies. Well, we're not doing that. It's business as usual. It's thinking as usual. Unless we can, in the words of Abraham Lincoln, disenthrall ourselves, we are doomed. It's just that simple.
Well, Professor, that's a big order, but it seems to me that, we just undervalue diplomacy and dialogue so significantly. And it would seem that that would be the way to get this conversation going. Some world leader or leaders are going to have to engage others and start this conversation about climate change, the impact it's having on all of us, and how ridiculous it is for us to keep expanding our militaries and expanding our presence around the world in that cycle that Professor Crawford talks about. And in fact, at one point, I think you point out, Professor, that security strategy is counterproductive on a number of different occasions. You talked about that particularly in the Middle East, right?
Right. So the United States has, since the 1980s, had military forces prepared to, with the Rapid Deployment Force and then later Central Command, to intervene in the Middle East very rapidly, and now has tens of thousands of forces either in the water or on land there still. And that has led to people in the region not wanting the United States presence, and they didn't find a solution through their own governments to keep the US out. What they did was they then tried to change their regimes, as they did in Iran, and succeeded, or these governments have repressed their own people so that they could have the relationship that they wanted in terms of selling their oil. But the part of this that is most counterproductive, I think, is the idea that military forces, which are intended to be the most efficient and effective means to solving problems, it's actually, as Governor Brown argues, the opposite sometimes, that they aren't efficient and they're counterproductive. And I also think that part of the solution here is to question that idea that they're efficient and effective, and think about the ways that the use of force has both led to increased dependence on fossil fuels and other resources, and think about ways to decrease that dependence.
I think the military is what it is because of ideas, because of belief systems that operate in Washington today, operate in Moscow, operate in Great Britain and China. And we've got to get at those ideas and deconstruct them, demystify the 19th century nationalism that still very much pervades what we're doing. And the military is a good handle to reduce the threat by reducing the spending. That's crucial.
Oh. We have people writing in a question on that and want to know what can the public do? What can we do to stimulate the public to take some action about the effects of militarism on the climate and that whole impact on that? Well,
I think look, we had a million people in Central Park in 1982 protesting the danger of and the threat of the nuclear weapons. Right now, people have so many other things on their mind. We have the elections, we got Trump, we got this thing, the Proud Boys, the conservatives are worried about what's going on in school and how parents are losing their rights from their point of view. So we got a lot of issues that are all over the place. But the big issue, climate change and the threat of war, is becoming greater and greater. And somehow we're going to have to get a handle on it. The second point I want to make, that we are not only at an inflection point, but remember, America is 4.1% of the 8 billion people, all right? And we are basically in a position where we're boss. We set the rules, we have the rules-based order, and we got to defend it. Now, there's a bunch of other countries like China, which is 23% of the 8 billion. They have a different set of rules, as does Russia, as does Iran, a few other people, so a few other nations. So we're going to have to get at the difficult job of living in a world where almost 96% of the people are not American. And we're so overextended, we're so divided, and we're engaged in a totally paradoxical quest for security that's making us ever more insecure. And time is running out. If we can avoid a nuclear war, hallelujah. But we're not going to avoid the climate horror and disruption that's coming around. And we know here in California, the fires are burning. Millions of people can no longer buy fire insurance. So that's going to make their lives extremely difficult. So climate change is closing in on us, and we have to respond. And the response has to be, as part, getting hold of the military. And I have to say, so far, we're nowhere on that front. I mean, we are moving more aggressively. And the thing about our activity, however, in good faith it is, that we're creating the very demons that we're reacting to. That's what I mean by cybernetic. We're not in one place over against something else. We are constituted, we are created by that which we ourselves do, as well as the other people. We're caught in this muddle of interacting threats, ideas, and information. And the only way forward is the willingness to engage in dialogue, diplomacy, and awareness, and bring the awareness of transnational threats. Climate is a perfect example of that. And we're making some progress. The Paris Agreement was extraordinary, but we're falling back from that because the old nationalisms are raising their ugly head. And I wouldn't minimize the horror of the Ukrainian war one bit, but now how we deal with that and how we work toward a world of mutual interest, that's the dilemma. And so far, I don't see we're getting closer to a wise set of positions. I think we're going in the opposite direction.
Professor, you write about the military's concentration on adaptation as opposed to mitigation of this problem. They recognize the problem and they've been dealing with it, but they tend to try to adapt to it as opposed to mitigate it. You see any hope in your research and your work on this of changing that dynamic, of getting the military to step forward and start talking about mitigation as opposed to just how they're going to adapt to a current situation?
Well, I think they have three things that they're concerned about. First of all, they're concerned about adaptation at bases, and they want greater resilience, and they want to make sure that their operations, secondly, aren't affected. But they have turned to mitigation. The point I was trying to make earlier is that they have goals for mitigation, though, that is reduction of their greenhouse gas emissions, which are not actually ambitious because they've nearly met them already. So when they say, for example, that they want to reduce the Air Force wants to reduce by 50% their emissions at installations, they have reduced those emissions. Their baseline is 2008. They have already dramatically cut their emissions at bases, but they don't talk about operational emissions, that is, emissions from training, exercises with other countries, or war. Now, when they do think about operational emissions, they're talking about electrifying vehicles or changing fuel mixes. But the real cut in emissions would be from cutting operations and exercises and combat. And that can be done, right? The military doesn't set its own battles, but we could say, We don't need to use military force in regions. We don't need to be patrolling the Persian Gulf anymore to the extent that the US is, and that we could say that we could reduce the military presence in other regions, for instance, Africa and the Pacific, and that would reduce emissions. But the idea that the military should be leading is, I think,
Fantasy.
asking them to do something which they're not equipped to do. And in this sense, first of all, as I said, military missions is more greenhouse gas intensive than other sectors. We've counted on the military for innovation, but counting on them to do innovations is asking them to do something that they're not efficient at doing. If innovations in, let's say, battery technology or fuel technology are better done in the commercial sector. So yes, they should be reducing emissions, but we shouldn't be counting on them to lead the United States in that way.
Well, we could count on Congress a bit here. And I think one of the frustrating things is we all know David Vine and the work that he's done on the number of bases, well over 700 bases outside of the United States. And the idea that the more bases we build, the more threat there is to other nations, the more likelihood that those bases are going to lead to a situation where conflict escalates. People are threatened by it, or people in the United States see those bases as a reason to get involved in a part of the world that could lead to that basis. And talking about reducing the presence there, the military may want to do it from case to case to talk about adapting their bases away from the threat of climate change, but Congress may want to do it to reduce the threat to other nations and the threat environment, as well as to, decrease the situation because of climate conflict. So, cutting emissions on the basis of one thing, cutting the bases, which seems to me would be a much larger issue and probably more productive in getting it accomplished.
Yeah,
Well,
John, let me give you another problem. Oh, go ahead.
Could I just say something about the bases? The DoD has for years said that they have 16 to 18% over capacity at bases. They themselves see that there's room to reduce the bases and installations. And the second point is that the US military has for decades been over-insuring against threats. And I think that's what the Ukraine war tells us. It tells us that the US did not need to spend many billions and trillions of dollars defending against the Soviet Union and then Russia, when a small civilian-based force could bring the Russians to a standstill and then indeed push them back with some assistance. So we've overpaid and overinsured, and I think that tells us we are, yes, the United States is preeminent, but it's so far ahead of other nations that we could actually pause many of our plans for, let's say, changing and enhancing the nuclear arsenal, enhancing conventional aircraft, ships. We could pause them and still be well ahead of the rest of the world.
There's another problem here that I want to indicate. The 700 bases, and I wonder, are these big bases, these 3 people, 10 people, 500 people? That's something I'm kind of interested in. But whatever there are, 700 serious bases or 300, we're setting the model. And the human animal is very emulative, likes to emulate. Okay, China, give an example. They have 1 or 2 bases. In fact, they want to put one in the Pacific, and America gets very excited about that. Well, wait a minute. If 4% of the people feel the need for 700 bases, how many bases does 1.4 billion people, or 23% of the world, how many do they think they need? And I can tell you this, they need more than 3 in their minds. So our 700 bases is a pacing. We talk about the pacing threat of China. The US is a pacing threat to China. So China, until they have 700 bases, is not there yet. And after they get 700, they may even want, well, I don't know about that, because they're so much bigger. So let me give you a concrete example of that, how that works. We have thousands of nuclear weapons, right? China had 300. Well, we didn't reduce, even though Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty says we're supposed to be negotiating in good faith to reduce. We're not doing that. So what's China doing? Now they're going to, intelligence tells us, they're going up to 1,000 nukes, because we have even more than that. By the way, when they get to 1,000, they may want to go higher because we're higher. And the idea of an arms agreement now is stigmatized, is really thought to be questionable in many sectors in Washington. So I'd say we got a real issue here, and it's systematic. It's driving this military spending, which itself is a major contributor to the climate disruption. So I think it's good to crucial to face it on the military, because as we bring down the civilian expenditures, if the military machine with the Pentagon, the defense contractors, the think tanks that get so much of their money from the military, if that system continues to operate as it has, the military will not reduce its climate emissions, its carbon emissions. It's going to get worse. So this is somewhat of a technical book, but it's really putting in our face the insanity of the military posture that is embraced by both parties, by the liberals as well as conservatives. Like some of the conservatives in the Cato Institute are more skeptical of our military pretensions than the liberals over there at Brookings and some of those other places. So I think the conclusion here is we got to wake up this country, and we shouldn't limit ourselves to Republicans or Democrats. It is a more universal threat, and the solution has to be a broader-based effort to deconstruct the errors and myths that are driving us forward.
Well, the only way in part to do that is, again, through transparency, through dialogue, through diplomacy. And yet both parties in Congress are on a race to see who can demonize Russia and China and anybody else that they perceive as a threat more, and cut off conversation. Try to put bills in sometimes that will not allow the military to military contacts, or not have diplomatic contacts, which is exactly in the opposite direction. And Governor, you point out a good point. China doesn't want to get involved in multilateral negotiation for arms control, why the United States and Russia have 1,550 to their 350. They want to strive to get some parity so that they can negotiate from a point. And so when they start to build up to 1,000, the answer from too many people in our country is, well, then we have to build more than 1,550 that we have. It's ludicrous.
And President Biden wanted to eliminate a nuclear system, and the Democrats, along with the Republicans, put it back into the budget. So, and now we got a potential shift over to the Republicans. So the hour is late, and the danger is dire. So I think this book, I think the great merit here is in very concrete detail. Neta is laying out the history of how the military needed the coal, and the coal bases had to go to Hawaii and Asia to be able to make our ships go forward. Our ships have to go forward to get more fossil fuel, but they need fossil fuel to go forward. So we're caught in a muddle of a circular information, action, and response. And to get out of that is going to take a level of wisdom and clarity that we're missing. More than anything else, we need to pause and try to understand, where are we? What is taking us forward, and what is compounding our difficulty? And I would say in the Congress today, that's almost totally absent. In the Armed Services Committee, the chairman in the House is a good person. He can't control the majority of votes. And so we're going to have a citizen movement of greater intensity, because we're right now sleepwalking to a very dark future.
Professor, you talked toward the end of your book about the path forward. What do you see as the path forward?
Well, I think there's a couple of things we can do. First of all, as I suggested, we have to reduce our presence in the Persian Gulf region. That's for a couple of reasons. One is the threat is actually low there. And secondly, our presence is destabilizing. Another thing that we can do is rethink the bases and installations that we have around the globe. The 700 bases and installations range in size from thousands of people and to the mobile bases of the aircraft in the various fleets. Those can be reduced in size. Okay, and that would cut military spending. And then a third thing that we could be doing is, as an entire economy, transitioning away from fossil fuels. The transition away from fossil fuels has accelerated with this war in Ukraine. It was already growing in leaps and bounds in terms of solar and wind and geothermal. If we increase the rate of transition to renewables, moving away from coal, natural gas, and oil, what we do is we decrease our dependence on imported oil. And we also help the world decrease its use of fossil fuels. And that makes countries less insecure about access to those fuels. So a transition away from fossil fuels will actually democratize energy, making it, with renewables available closer to the source. There's less dependence on importation. And so those are some of the things that we could be doing right now. But again, the villain here isn't the military, it's the way we think about A, force, B, the necessity and the efficiency of the military in solving our problems, right? And then our sense of what's worth defending. And it's not worth defending this oil, right? It's just we can move away to a new economy.
Well,
We've had a number of people question, just how many bases the United States has on that. I would just make reference again to David Vine, V-I-N-E, who's written extensively on that and has an entire group about overseas bases. I know, Neta, you know David well, and the work that he's done on that is in that, together with your work, give people a good idea of the sizes of these bases and the numbers of them and where they're situated and how many troops are deployed at each and every one of them, to the extent that the military shares and doesn't classify it. So that information is out there, and we can build on that. But I think it comes back to getting Congress to start doing some oversight work. They ought to know these things. I'm not sure they do. They ought to be questioning each and every base as what its purpose is and what the risk of having a base in a particular location is, not just with the climate, but in terms of threat escalation and conflict, and moving toward that ground. I think the amount of work that you did on the research on this project, Professor Crawford, is enormous. I don't know how you managed to plow all through it and get it to the detail that you did. Did you find the military cooperative when you were doing this?
Well, I didn't. Well, first of all, as I said, the United States Department of Defense blocked through the negotiation process at Kyoto the inclusion of emissions in national reporting. This came up in Glasgow last year at the Conference of the Parties for Climate Change, and it's going to come up again in Sharm el-Sheikh in the next few weeks, where military missions are not reported consistently. And in fact, they don't have to be reported in national emissions reporting because bunker fuels are not included, and that's the overseas fuels, and military operations emissions are not included. So the first step would be to have transparency in reporting, not just for the United States, but for all governments of their military emissions. And people at Sharm el-Sheikh will be arguing for that. But no, the military has kept this information pretty close. And what I've calculated has been based on the Department of Energy information for fuel use that is available for operations and installations facilities. And so you can do a direct calculation based on that. But I think that that's still, my number, let's say from 1975 of nearly 110 million metric tons annually is the tip of the iceberg of all military emissions when you think about the fact that it does not include emissions from, let's say, destruction of an oil platform, as the United States has done and other countries have done, from in the beginning, in World War I and World War II, attacking the other side's oil infrastructure or other infrastructure. And it does not include the fact of the destruction from of forests. When, for instance, a government burns a forest like the US did in Vietnam through the use of napalm and defoliants, it takes carbon out of the atmosphere. So I have only estimated, the forests take carbon out of the atmosphere. I've only estimated the direct emissions, but there's lots more to understand about this. And no, the military wasn't helpful, but they didn't block me either. It just wasn't there.
Well, not the least of that also is all the military industrial base and their use of energy and their contributions to climate change, just the way they gear up. It brings us back to the governor's point of the profit motive of keeping a lot of this going. Is there a place in the market, maybe for environmental, social, and governmental ESG investment to sort of get at that profit motive?
Well, the profit motive is real big. Money talks. We heard about that. It's true. Look, the 100 million, I guess I said billion before, it's actually in the millions, 100 million metric tons. California emits about 390 million tons. But we weren't counting forest fires. And those forest fires are, really increasing the number. Same thing with the military. We don't count the wars and all that that's doing. And then the other thing that I think we have to keep coming back to is the cybernetic effect or the emulation effect. Whatever we're doing with our 100 million metric tons, so is China, so is Great Britain, so is France. All these other countries are copying us. So, or we're copying them. We're all in it together in collective stupidity. So we have to reduce, and we have to get others to reduce, and we have to start talking about it. And we're not doing that. And if you just take the weapons sales, which are part of the military, the weapons sales in the world are close to 2 trillion every year. And America does 37%. And I think Russia's number 2, and France is in there, and China's catching up. I mean, it's crazy. And the extent of the deviance from sensible policy is so great that it's even hard to utter. I mean, our politics, we're so caught up in all the important stuff that, well, the important stuff that democracy may go out the window with all these fanatics running for Secretary of State. Yeah, that's a big problem. But we've got to keep our eye on the big picture, and the big picture as well, and that is climate, and the military is a major contributor, and almost like a trim tab. If you push the military down in terms of emissions, and if you count them properly, we become more aware, and we can bring down the rest of the emissions. I mean, what's an amazing thing to me is that the strategic talks with Russia have been shut off by the United States. And however bad Putin is, and however many people are being killed, if we have a nuclear exchange, it'll multiply hundreds of times. So not talking is really not thinking clearly. That's where we are. So I think this book, it's hard to grapple with because there's a lot of numbers there, but it's very persuasive. And I hope our military folks and the congressional staffers read some of this stuff. I don't know how much the congressmen read. It's my impression, I can reveal that secret as a retired politician. Politicians are talking a lot. They're not thinking that much, and they're not reading that much. So you're gonna have to get the staffers to weigh into this book because it is historically and contemporaneously is laying out a significant contributor on the part of the military. And if we could get at that, that'll help us get at the civilian causes of pollution. We got to work at all angles, that's for sure.
Well, as you know, in your life with the National Nuclear Threat Initiative, and Professor Crawford knows from her work on Council for a Livable World, there's a significant amount of time is spent trying to educate and inform staff. And it generally means taking a tremendous work like Professor Crawford's and distilling it down to a page or two of facts that can be shared that lead people to have the curiosity to continue on that. And, we need to keep doing that to bring it up on the Hill. Yes, Congress people are busy and can't read everything that goes out, but that's a place for organizations within that community to get that information to them in a digestible form and to share with their staffs and educate them on that basis. And so, Professor Crawford, I can see some work that'll be being done with your book as a basis for that, and trying to get people to look into it for the educational purposes, come to some of the realizations that we've talked about here today.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, I think a good point of this book is for the military not to take too much pleasure in their greater efficiency. It's if you can turn a tank into a battery operated tank and you're still causing flamethrowers and death and destruction, it's not going to do you any good. So efficiency could be a diversionary campaign. Good idea to be efficient, better to reduce the overall weight and the climate emissions that the military represents.
Kelly, I see you've rejoined us. I assume you want to bring this thing to a natural close in some respects.
Actually, I mean, it does sound like a natural close, but if anybody has any concluding statements, no rush on my part.
Okay.
So if I could say something that I think is really important, when I tell you that emissions were 109 million metric tons at the end of the Vietnam War annually, and then they declined after the Vietnam War, then they went up during the Reagan administration in the Cold War, and then they declined after the end of the Cold War and went up for the 1991 Gulf War, and then they declined and then they went up. You could see that what we do in terms of war makes a difference, that you can have an emissions reduction. Right now, there are 51 million metric tons, and that's because the way we make war is different. 51 million metric tons for the last 2 years. It's a great reduction, but that's still larger than most countries' annual emissions. And that's what I think we have to keep in mind, is the scale of these operations, even though they are greatly diminished, is still significant and more than most countries of the world.
Governor, you want to share some final thoughts?
Well, I'll give a more an optimistic note here. The horror of Ukraine, that war and all the killing, still the response in some quarters is to get off fossil fuel. Now, there's been some extra coal burning, but nevertheless, when Europe gets off Russian gas, they are going to have to look for non-fossil fuel alternatives. And in fact, that's going on. It'll take a few years, but the absurdity of current thinking and policy is manifested. Among the horrors of the Ukraine war, we're seeing clearly that we can't keep following this fossil fuel nightmare further into dependency. So we need that break. And that's the real key here, that we're caught in this interacting, escalating dependency on fossil fuel, climate disruption, more fossil fuel, more war. It's all feeding itself. And we got to stop that feeding frenzy. And that takes wisdom, it takes activism, and it takes a very unusual people like the Quincy Institute, who, despite the mockery of the status quo and the thin thinkers on Capitol Hill, continues their programming. And I just want to tell you, I appreciate that very much.
Professor Crawford, last word?
No, that's good enough.
Great. Well, thank you both. I've enjoyed having a conversation with you. And Kelly, thank you for giving us the opportunity to discuss what was a really fantastic and well done piece of journalism.
It really was. And thank you, Congressman, for your excellent moderation of this panel. And thank you, Governor and Professor Crawford. That was excellent. There was so much food for thought there. And I noted in the comments, there are a lot of people writing in and appreciating the context and the potential solutions to all of these problems. So please, if you can, Professor Crawford's book, The Pentagon, Climate Change and War, Charting the Rise and Fall of U.S. Military Emissions, is on sale now. Please check it out online. And please check out everything that we do at the Quincy Institute, quincyinst.org. Thank you, Governor, for those wonderful thoughts about Quincy. It means a lot to us. And we will be holding another panel next week, Thursday after the elections, to see how the dynamics, the power dynamics might have changed after next week's midterms. So please check in at our website for the link there before next week. And thank you for all of you out there listening today, and hope to see you again and joining us on our panels.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. See you next.